The breath of the grave, the iron-grey sky of the Istrian peninsula hung low, heavy with the scent of impending snow and wood smoke. In the heart of the 17th century, the village of Kringar was not a place of peace, but a fortress of stone and silence. The silence was shattered by the sound of a bone-deep impact. In the clearing just beyond the dense, frost-bitten forest, two figures were locked in a dance of primal violence. There was no preamble, no shouted insults, only the rhythmic, wet thud of fists meeting flesh on the sharp crack of a branch underfoot. Jor Grando, a man whose hands were usually caked in mortar and stone dust, was unrecognizable. His eyes, normally dull with the fatigue of a padrero's labor, were wide, reflecting a cold, predatory light. His opponent, a hunter clad in tattered furs, swung a heavy wood-axe. The blade whistled through the freezing air, missing Jor's throat by a hair's breadth and embedding itself into a gnarled oak. Jor didn't flinch. Instead, he lunged forward, his fingers hooking into the hunter's collar like iron talons. He slammed the man against the frozen trunk with a force that shouldn't belong to a common builder. The hunter gasped, blood blooming like a dark rose on his lip. He looked into Jor's face and saw something that made his blood turn to ice, colder than the Istrian winter. Jor wasn't angry. He was starving. Why? The hunter wheezed, his hands clawing at Jor's wrists. Jor didn't answer. He leaned in close, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches, as if his lungs were filled with silt. He bared his teeth, not in a snarl, but in a fixed, terrifying smile that reached neither his eyes nor his soul. With a sudden, violent twist, Jor hurled the man into the undergrowth and turned toward the village, leaving the hunter trembling in the guider. Days later, the bells of Kringar told Jor Grando Alilovich was dead. The funeral was a somber affair. The air inside the small stone church was thick with incense and the stifling heat of too many bodies in a small space. Ivana, Jor's widow, stood by the open pine box, her face a mask of pale grief. Her children, Anna and Nicola, clung to her skirts, their eyes wide with a confusion they couldn't name. Father Giorgio moved through the ritual with practiced solemnity, but his hands shook as he held the crucifix. He knew the traditions. He knew that in Kringar, the dead required a specific kind of insurance. The nail, whispered Miro Haditad, the village leader, leaning toward the priest. The tongue must be pierced. We cannot risk a strigan. Giorgio looked at the corpse. Jor looked peaceful, yet his skin had a translucent, waxy sheen that felt wrong. Just as the priest reached for the iron nail, a piercing, inhuman shriek erupted from the graveyard outside. The congregation bolted. Panic surged through the pews as people scrambled toward the doors, fearing an attack from the wolves or worse. In the chaos, the coffin lid was slammed shut by a frightened acolyte. The heavy lid was hammered down, the iron nails driven into the wood with frantic speed. The ritual was forgotten. Jor Grandar was lowered into the earth with his tongue whole and his soul restless. That night the frost grew thick on Ivana's window. She lay in the hollow silence of her bed, the scent of her husband's old wool coat still lingering in the room. Then it came. Thump, thump, thump. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the heavy oak door downstairs. Ivana froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one visited after the sun vanished behind the hills. She waited, breathless, until the sound of the latch clicking echoed through the house. The stairs creaked, a slow, rhythmic step, step, drag, step. The bedroom door drifted open. The Gita followed the figure inside, a mist that smelled of damp earth and old stone. There, at the foot of her bed, stood Jor. He wore his burial clothes, stained with the soil of the consecrated ground. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his chest unmoving, wearing that same impossible smile. Ivana tried to scream, but the air vanished from her lungs. As he moved toward her, she realized the nightmare had only just begun. The pierced silence, the heavy oak door of Ivana's home didn't just open, it surrendered to the cold. The frost that crept across the floorboards looked like skeletal fingers reaching for her feet. At the foot of the bed, Jor Grandau stood as a monument to the impossible. His burial shroud was damp, clinging to a frame that no longer knew the warmth of blood. He didn't move, he didn't blink, he only smiled. Jor. Ivana's voice was a jagged whisper, a plea to a man who was now a ghost of salt and stone. You were buried, the soil, the priest. The figure took a step. There was no sound of breathing, only the dry scrape of leather against wood. Jor leaned over her, his shadow swallowing the candlelight. The smell was overwhelming, not of rot, but of ancient earth and stagnant water. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her cheek. His skin was the color of a drowned moon. I am not gone, Ivana, he seemed to say, though his lips never moved. The words vibrated in the very marrow of her bones. They forgot to lock the gate. Outside, the village of Cringer was waking up to a new kind of terror. Father Giorgio sat in his study, the iron nail he had failed to use still resting on his desk. It mocked him. He knew that a Strigan was born from neglect, and he was the one who had hesitated. A frantic pounding at his door broke his trance. It was Miro Hadatit, his face gaunt. He's been seen, Father, near the well. Old Merrick, he received the knocks, 3 of them. He died before the sun could even think of rising. The priest stood, grabbing his heavy wool cloak. Gather the men, Miro. We must check the boundaries. If he is walking, he is marking his territory. Back in the cottage, the tension was a physical weight. Jor's presence was a suffocating blanket of cold. He didn't attack her with violence. He attacked her with familiarity. He sat on the edge of the bed, the wood groaning under a weight that felt far heavier than a man's. He looked at the cradle in the corner where Nikolaya slept. He has my eyes, Jor whispered, the sound like dead leaves skittering on a tombstone. Don't touch him. Ivana found her strength, lunging forward to shield the cradle. Jor turned his gaze back to her. For a fleeting second, the terrifying smile faltered, replaced by a hunger so deep it seemed to pull the heat right out of her skin. He stood up, towering over her, and leaned down until his cold forehead touched hers. I built this house to last forever, Ivana, he hissed, and I intend to stay in it. With a sudden gust of wind that blew out every candle in the room, he was gone. Ivana collapsed to her knees, gasping for air that finally felt warm again. But as she looked at the heavy oak door, she saw 3 faint, frost-covered indentations on the wood. The marking had begun. The mark of the 3rd knock that on in Kringjar brought no light. Only a thickening of the grey mist that clung to the stone walls like a shroud. Father Giorgio stood before the heavy door of old Merrick's cottage. The wood was splintered around the latch, but not from a forced entry. It looked as if the wood itself had withered and died. There, etched into the grain, were 3 deep indentations. They weren't made by a fist. They were scorched into the oak, smelling faintly of ozone and old stagnant blood. He doesn't just visit, Miro Hadatit whispered, his voice trembling as he crossed himself. he claims. Marek was the strongest of us, father. If Yor can take him in a single night. He didn't take him with strength, Miro, Giorgio replied, his fingers tracing the cold marks. He took him with a sentence. The Strigan does not fight. He simply decides who is next. Inside the cottage, the air was unnaturally still. Marek lay in his bed, his eyes wide and clouded with a milky film. There were no wounds on his throat, no signs of a struggle. He looked as if his very soul had been drained through his pores, leaving behind a hollow husk of a man. Meanwhile, at the edge of the village, Ivana was a prisoner in her own home. She had spent the night clutching a silver crucifix, watching the shadows stretch and warp. Every creak of the floorboards felt like Jor's cold hand on her shoulder. She looked at the frost marks on her own door. She was the widow of the monster, but she was also his tether. A shadow fell across her kitchen table. It wasn't Jor. It was Stipan Milas, a man whose eyes held a hardness that even the priest lacked. He didn't knock. He simply entered, his boots heavy on the stone. "He came to you last night," Stipan stated, his voice a low growl. "Don't lie, Ivana. The Gida follows him, and your house is the coldest in the village." "He is my husband," she hissed, though her heart was cold with dread. "He was a Pedrero," Stipan countered, slamming a heavy iron saw onto the table. "Now he is a plague. The village is dying, house by house. If you won't help us find where he hides during the day, we will burn this house with you and the children inside." Ivana looked at the saw. The teeth were jagged, designed to bite through bone and stone alike. The tension in the room was a physical cord, stretched to the breaking point. "He doesn't hide in the earth," Ivana whispered, her eyes darting to the cellar door. "He hides in the walls. He built this house, Stipan. He is in the very stone." As she spoke, a low, rhythmic thud echoed from beneath the floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. The marking was no longer just on the doors. It was in the foundation. The whispers in the stone, the first blow of the sledgehammer, didn't sound like iron hitting rock. It sounded like a gasp. Stipan Milas swung with the fury of a man possessed, his muscles bulging under his salt-stained tunic. The head of the hammer connected with the central pillar of the cellar, the very spine of the house Jor had built with his own hands. Instead of stone chips flying, a fine crimson mist puffed out from the cracks. "Did you hear that?" one of the men whispered, dropping his pickaxe. The cellar, usually damp and smelling of turnips, now reeked of ozone and copper. "Keep swinging," Stipan roared, though his own hands were trembling. "He is in here. I can feel his cold." Upstairs, Ivana stood in the center of the kitchen, her feet bare on the flagstones. She could feel the vibrations traveling up through the soles of her feet, not as tremors but as heartbeats. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a ribcage, and they were inside the beast. Thump, thump, thump. The knocks didn't come from the door this time. They came from the ceiling. Ivana looked up and saw the plaster cracking in 3 perfect, circular patterns directly above Nicola's cradle. "He's not in the cellar," she breathed, her voice failing her. She lunged for the cradle just as a section of the stone wall near the hearth began to liquefy. The solid rock rippled like water, turning a translucent, bruised purple. A hand emerged, not a skeletal one, but a hand of solid, polished marble, cold enough to frost the air. Jor didn't crawl out. He unfolded from the architecture. He stood between Ivana and the door, his height seemingly doubled by the shadows of the rafters. His eyes were no longer clouded. They were 2 pits of absolute winter. "You invited them to break my bones, Ivana." Joel's voice didn't come from his throat, It echoed from the walls themselves, 1,000 stones speaking at once. Every stone they break is a piece of your soul. I take to replace it. Downstairs, a scream cut through the cellar. Stippen had managed to pry a stone loose, only to find not dirt or mortar behind it, but clotted, pulsing veins of dark ichor. The house was bleeding. Jaws stepped toward Ivana, his presence so cold it turned her breath into ice crystals before her face. He leaned down, his marble-hard fingers tilting her chin up. "The men think they are the hunters," Jaw hissed, his smile widening until it looked like a wound. "But they are only providing the mortar for my next wall." With a sudden violent shudder, the cellar stairs collapsed, trapping Stippen and his men in the dark. Jaw turned his gaze toward the cradle, and for the first time, Nicola began to cry, a sound that was answered by a low, rhythmic growl from the very foundation of Kringa. The blood of the foundation. The darkness in the cellar was not empty, it was viscous. Stippen Melas pressed his back against the cold stone, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. Every time he moved, the walls seemed to ripple, the stone yielding like bruised flesh. The iron saw he had used to threaten Ivana now felt like a toy against the pulsing, obsidian veins that had begun to map the architecture. "He's not just in the walls," one of the men whimpered, his voice cracking. "He is the walls." A low, rhythmic vibration began to hum through the floorboards, a sound like a massive heart struggling to beat. Suddenly, a section of the floor near Stippen's feet split open. It didn't crack, it tore. From the gap, a thick, dark ichor began to well up, smelling of copper and ancient sunless places. The mortar, Stippen breathed, his eyes wide with a realization that shattered his remaining courage. He didn't use lime and sand. He used this. Upstairs, the transformation was nearly complete. The kitchen was no longer a room, it was a throat. Gior Grando stood before Ivana, his marble skin now veined with the same dark ichor that was flooding the cellar. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, and for the first time he didn't smile. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying loneliness. "You think I returned for blood, Ivana?" Gior's voice was a chorus of grinding stones. "I returned for permanence. Kringa is a village of ghosts, but I am the only one who refused to fade. I am the stone that will never crumble." He reached out and touched the wall behind her. As his fingers made contact, the stone turned translucent, revealing the terrified faces of Stippen and his men trapped below, their bodies slowly being encased in the hardening rock. They weren't being killed, they were being assimilated. "They wanted to destroy my house," Gior hissed. "Now, they will be the pillars that hold it up for eternity." Ivana looked at the faces in the stone, their silent screams frozen in the rock. She realized then that Gior's plan wasn't just for her or the children. He was turning the entire village into a living monument to his own restless soul. Thump, thump, thump. The knocks echoed again, but this time they came from every house in Krengar simultaneously. The village was answering its master. Gior turned his gaze back to Nikolai's cradle, his hand reaching out to touch the child's forehead. "He will be the cornerstone," Gior whispered, "the first of a new kind of builder." Ivana lunged, not with a weapon, but with the only thing she had left, the silver crucifix. As the metal touched Gior's marble skin, a sound like a mountain collapsing filled the air. But Gior didn't vanish. He simply absorbed the cold of the silver, his eyes turning into mirrors of the crucifix itself. "Your God has no power over the earth, I have claimed," he growled, and the floor beneath Ivana began to soften. The frost in the cradle, the silver of the crucifix, didn't burn. It froze. As the metal touched his marble-veined skin, a jagged line of frost erupted from the point of contact, spreading across his chest like a winter web. But Jaw didn't recoil. He gripped Ivana's wrist with fingers that felt like iron bands, his eyes reflecting the silver light until they became two mirrors of cold judgment. "You offer me the symbol of a man who died for the world." Jaw's voice was a tectonic grind, vibrating through the floorboards. "I am the man who lived for this soil. I am the stone that remembers every drop of sweat and blood shed in Kringar." He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned over the cradle. Ivana's breath hitched as she saw the frost from Jaw's body begin to mist over Nicola's blankets. The child's crying stopped abruptly. Nicola didn't look afraid. His small eyes were fixed on Jaw, turning a pale, translucent gray that matched the winter sky outside. "He is cold, Ivana," Jaw whispered, a terrifying tenderness in his tone, "because the warmth of the living is a lie that fades with the sun. I am giving him the truth of the mountain." Downstairs, the sound of the sledgehammers had been replaced by a wet, rhythmic pulsing. The cellar was no longer a room of stone. It was a chamber of bone. Stipin Milas was gone, his face now a permanent, agonized relief on the central pillar, his eyes replaced by glowing embers of dark ichor. The house was breathing now, a slow, heavy wheeze that smelled of wet earth and old iron. Suddenly, the front door of the cottage burst open. Father Giorgio stood, framed against the moonlight, his robes tattered and his face streaked with soot. He held a heavy iron censer, smoke billowing from it in thick, acrid clouds. "Jewel Grando," the priest bellowed, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The earth rejects you, the stone cries out against your presence." Jaw turned, his smile returning, wider and more jagged than before. "The stone is mine, Giorgio. I carved it. I laid it. I am it." With a flick of his wrist, Jewel sent a ripple through the floor. The flagstones rose up like a wave, throwing the priest backward into the mud outside. But as Giorgio fell, he threw the censer into the hearth. The holy incense hit the embers, and a blinding, white-hot flame erupted, turning the copper smell of the house into the scent of a burning cathedral. The house shrieked. It wasn't a sound of wood or stone, but a collective howl of the souls Jua had trapped in the foundation. For a second, Jaw's marble skin cracked, revealing a hollow, lightless void beneath. "You cannot burn what is already cold," Jaw roared, but for the first time he retreated toward the shadows of the hearth, his form beginning to blur into the smoke. Ivana snatched Nicola from the cradle, the child's skin feeling like polished glass against her own. She ran toward the door, but as she reached the threshold, she felt a cold, wet hand brush against her ankle. "You can run, Ivana," the walls whispered in unison. "But every step you take is on my back." The cemetery of whispers, the mud outside the cottage, was no longer just earth. It was a viscous, black sludge that seemed to pull at Ivana's boots with every step. Behind her, the house she once called home was a silhouette of jagged stone. Pulsing with a faint, bruised light from the hearth fire, Ivana clutched Nicola against her chest. The child was unnaturally still, his skin as cold as the silver crucifix that had failed to stop Yor. She didn't look back at Father Giorgio, who was struggling to stand amidst the ruins of the threshold. She ran toward the only place that felt like an ending, the cemetery. The path was a gauntlet of shadows. The trees on either side of the road didn't sway. They leaned, their frozen branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. "You cannot outrun the foundation, Ivana," the wind hissed, carrying 1,000 voices from the stone walls she passed. "Every house you see is a cell in my body." She reached the iron gates of the cemetery. They were encrusted with a thick layer of black frost that burned her hands as she pushed them open. The air here was different, heavy with the smell of spent incense and ancient, dry bone. In the center of the graveyard, Jor's empty tomb stood like an open mouth. "Ivana." She spun around. Jor wasn't standing on the ground. He was emerging from a headstone, his marble form translucent under the moonlight. He looked weary, the cracks in his skin glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse of dark ichor. "Give me the boy," Jor commanded, his voice a low, tectonic rumble. "He is the bridge. Through him I will not just be a memory in Kringa. I will be its future. He is a child of the living." Ivana screamed, her voice cracking in the freezing air. "He is a child of the stone now," Jor countered, stepping forward. As he moved, the graves around him began to shudder. The earth didn't break. It opened like a series of slow, wet blinks. From the soil, the other forgotten dead began to rise, not as skeletons, but as statues of mud and ice, their eyes glowing with the same mirrored light as Jor's. They were his army, his congregation. Father Giorgio appeared at the gate, holding a heavy iron shovel and a flask of holy water that was already beginning to freeze. "The ritual, Ivana," the priest shouted. "We must return the head to the earth, but first we must break the smile." Jor let out a sound that was half laugh, landslide. "You think a shovel can break what the mountain has forged?" As the statues of mud began to circle them, Nikolai opened his eyes. They were no longer gray. They were solid, polished obsidian. The smile of the abyss, the obsidian eyes of the child, didn't just reflect the moonlight. They seemed to swallow it. Nikola's small hands, once soft and warm, now had the texture of polished flint. He reached out toward Gur, a low, rhythmic vibration humming from his chest, a sound that matched the tectonic pulse of the graveyard. "He's waking up, Ivana," Gur whispered, his marble face cracking into a grin that revealed a hollow, lightless void. "The boy knows his father. He knows the weight of the mountain." Father Giorgio lunged forward, swinging the heavy iron shovel. The blade connected with the shoulder of a mud statue that was closing in on Ivana. The impact sounded like a hammer hitting wet clay. The statue didn't fall. It simply absorbed the shovel, the mud crawling up the handle toward the priest's hands. "The smile, Giorgio!" Ivana screamed, noticing how Jor's expression seemed to be the anchor for the entire nightmare. "You said we must break the smile." The priest let go of the shovel just before the mud reached his skin. He reached into his tattered robes and pulled out a small, jagged piece of obsidian, a shard from the very foundation of the church. "Jor!" Giorgio bellowed, his voice echoing against the headstones. "You claim to be the stone of Kringa. Then feel the weight of the altar you abandoned." The priest threw the shard. It didn't fly like a stone. It moved like a streak of black lightning. It struck Jor directly in the center of his fixed, terrifying smile. The sound was catastrophic. It wasn't a scream, but the sound of a cathedral collapsing. Jor's face shattered. The marble skin spiderwebbed, and for a second, the impossible smile vanished, replaced by a jagged, gaping hole of pure shadow. The statues of mud and ice froze mid-stride, their glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. "My face." The walls of the cemetery seemed to groan, but the victory was short-lived. The dark ichor began to joro from the cracks in Jor's head, and instead of falling, he began to grow. The shadows from the open graves flowed toward him, stitching the marble back together into something larger, something more ancient. Nicola let out a sharp, metallic cry. The child's skin was now completely grey, and as he touched Ivana's arm, she felt a numbing frost spread through her veins. The smile was just the mask, pressed, the gargantuan shadow of Jor hissed, his voice now coming from the very earth beneath their feet. Now, you will see the face of the abyss. The ground beneath the tomb began to liquefy, turning into a whirlpool of black sludge that threatened to pull Ivana, the baby, and the priest into the depths of the foundation. The altar of the frozen sun, the whirlpool of black sludge, didn't just pull at Ivana's body. It pulled at her will. The cemetery was no longer a place of rest, but a digestive tract, and the earth was hungry for the living. Ivana held Nicola with a strength born of pure, maternal desperation. The child's skin had become so cold it felt like it was fusing to her own. She could feel the obsidian pulse of his heart against her ribs, a slow, heavy beat that sounded like a hammer on an anvil. "He is not yours anymore, Ivana," the gargantuan shadow of Jor roared, his form now towering over the highest mausoleums. "He is the first stone of my new world. Give him to the earth, and I will spare your soul." "Never." Ivana's voice was a ragged scream. She looked at Father Giorgio, who was submerged up to his waist in the black mire, still clutching the flask of holy water. "The abysmo, Ivana." Giorgio gasped, his face turning the color of ash. "It is not a hole in the ground. It is the void in his heart. You must fill it with something he cannot consume." Ivana looked at Jor's shattered face, the jagged hole where the smile used to be. She realized then that Jor wasn't just a monster of stone. He was a man who had forgotten how to love. He had traded his humanity for permanence, and the void was the price. She didn't use the crucifix. She didn't use the holy water. Ivana stepped toward the whirlpool, toward the center of the shadow. She reached out and pressed her warm, blood-filled palm against the cracked marble of Jor's chest, right where the dark ichor was joring out. "I remember you, Jor," she whispered, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "I remember the man who built our home with love, not just stone. I remember the father who held Aina and Nikolai before the Gida took his soul." The effect was instantaneous. Where her warm hand touched the cold marble, a blinding white light erupted. It wasn't the light of the sun, but the light of a memory, a spark of humanity in a world of obsidian. Jor's shadow form shrieked, but it wasn't a roar of anger. It was a cry of recognition. The marble began to soften, the cracks glowing with a soft, golden hue. I built it for you." Jor's voice was no longer a tectonic grind. It was the voice of a man, distant and fading. But as the light grew, Nicola let out a final, metallic wail. The child's obsidian eyes flickered, and for a second a spark of blue returned to them. The abysma began to collapse in on itself, pulling the shadows, the mud statues, and Jor's gargantuan form into a single crushing point of gravity. "Run, Ivana," Giorgio screamed, throwing his last ounce of strength into pushing her toward the gate. The cemetery exploded in a silent wave of white frost. The shattered monolith, the white frost, didn't just cover the ground, it crystallized the very air. As the abysmi collapsed, the gravitational pull became a silent, crushing weight that threatened to turn bone into dust. Ivana felt the world tilting, the iron gates of the cemetery groaning as they were sucked toward the center of the white light. "Jaw!" she cried out, her voice a thin thread in the roar of the implosion. The gargantuan shadow was gone. In its place stood a figure of cracked, glowing porcelain. Jaw was no longer a monster of obsidian. He was a man-shaped lantern, the light of Ivana's touch burning through the centuries of cold he had accumulated. He looked at his hands, once marble, now translucent and fading like mist under a morning sun. He turned his gaze to Nicola. The child was suspended in the air between them, his obsidian skin flaking away to reveal soft, pink flesh beneath. The boy's eyes were wide, the blue of the summer sky returning to them with a clarity that pierced the gloom. "The foundation. It needs a heart." Jaw's voice was a soft whisper, the sound of a dying hearth. "I thought it had to be stone. I was wrong." Jaw reached out, his glowing fingers brushing the top of Nikolai's head one last time. He wasn't taking the child's warmth. He was giving back everything he had stolen. The frost on Ivana's arm melted instantly, replaced by a surge of heat that made her heart leap. With a final, jagged smile, one of genuine peace, not terror, Jaw stepped into the very center of the collapsing abysma. "Build something that breathes, Ivana," he whispered. The implosion reached its zenith. A shockwave of pure, golden energy erupted from the center of the graveyard, expanding outward until it hit the stone walls of Kranga. Every house that Ajur had marked, every pilar that had begun to pulse with dark ichor, was purged. The obsidian veins withered and turned to ash, leaving behind only the silent, honest stone Jaw had laid as a living man. Ivana felt herself being thrown backward, the world spinning into a blur of white and gold. She clutched Nicola to her chest, shielding him with her own body as the cemetery vanished. When the light finally faded, the silence that followed was absolute. Ivana opened her eyes. She was lying on the grass just outside the cemetery gates. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, the first rays of dawn hitting the hills of Istria. Beside her, Father Giorgio was sitting up, coughing the black sludge from his lungs, his face pale but alive. She looked down at the bundle in her arms. Niccolo was breathing, a deep, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He looked at her and, for the first time in 16 years of nightmare, he smiled. It was the smile of a child, not a stone. Krenja stood on the hill, its chimneys beginning to smoke as the villagers woke from a sleep they hadn't known in nearly 2 decades. The Strigan was gone. The Padrero had finally finished his work. The echo of the Padrero, the village of Krenja, did not simply wake up. It reclaimed itself, as the golden light of the purge settled into the foundations. The air lost its metallic tongue of ozone, replaced by the sweet, honest scent of pine needles and damp earth. The unnatural Gedi that had gripped the valley for 18 years vanished, leaving behind a dew that sparkled like fallen stars on the grass. Ivana stood at the threshold of her home. The house was silent, but it was a living silence. The stones no longer whispered. They held the warmth of the rising sun. She looked to the central pillar where Stipan had been trapped. The rock was smooth, the agonized faces gone, returned to the dust from which they came. Jaw's final act had been a total erasure of his own darkness. Nicholas sat on the floor, playing with a small, smooth pebble. His skin was warm, his breath steady. He looked up at Ivana and reached out, his small fingers wrapping around her thumb. There was no frost, no obsidian chill, only the simple, fragile heat of a child. "Mama," he whispered. It was the first words spoken in a house that had known only growls and grinding stones for a generation. Ivana knelt and pulled him into her arms, weeping not for the terror she had endured, but for the future that had been restored. Father Giorgio stood in the village square, watching as the people of Krengar emerged from their homes. They looked at one another with a dazed, profound recognition. Neighbors who had lived in fear of one another's doors now reached out to touch hands, confirming that they were still flesh, still blood. The priest looked toward the cemetery. The iron gates were gone, and the hill where the abysmo had opened was now a smooth, grassy mound. No headstones remained, no markers of the dead. It was a tabula rasa, a clean slate for a village that had been haunted since its foundation. He didn't just save his family, Ivana, Giorgio said, appearing at her doorway as the bells of the church began to ring, a clear, joyous sound that echoed across the peninsula. He saved the very idea of us. He proved that even a heart of stone can be broken by a single spark of remembrance. Years passed. Krengar grew, its walls repaired with honest mortar, and its stories told around hearths that no longer feared the night. Nicola grew into a man with his father's hands, strong, capable, and skilled with stone. But he never built with the intention of permanence. He built with the knowledge that everything beautiful eventually fades, and that is what makes it sacred. Ivana lived to see her grandchildren play in the garden Jor had once haunted. She never spoke of the Strigan to them. Instead, she told them stories of a Padrero who loved a woman so much that he moved mountains to find his way back to her, and then gave up the mountain itself to keep her safe. The legend of Jor Grando would eventually find its way into the massive encyclopedias of scholars like Valvassa, becoming a footnote in the history of the macabre. But in Krengar the truth remained in the warmth of the stone and the blue of a child's eyes. The first vampire was gone, but the first man, the one who loved, labored, and sacrificed, was the one who truly remained.